Cook County Superior Court, Chicago, December 2006. It's 9:10 in the morning. You know how December mornings in Chicago are. The outside is lead gray, the sky looks blank and empty like it's lost its memory, and that cold, brutal wind coming off Lake Michigan hits your face like shards of glass. But today, nobody's complaining about the cold. Because inside Courtroom 23 of the Cook County Superior Court, a different kind of climate rules the room. The heating system is running slow. The clicking of the radiator echoes through the silence of the courtroom like a metronome. The gallery has been packed since early morning. Journalists, attorneys, curious faces. Nobody has permission to take photos, so every scratch of a pen, every cough, every footstep grows louder and fills the room. There are two tables up front. At the table on the right sits the most recognized athlete in the world, Michael Jordan. His navy suit sits on him perfectly. Not loose, not tight. Right where it needs to be. White button-down shirt, knotted tie. His eyes are fixed straight ahead. His gaze is laser-focused, locked onto some meaningless point in the distance. His hands are folded on the table, but you can see his fingers lace and unlace. A small, repetitive motion that only the most careful eye would catch, invisible to everyone else. For a man of deals, of million-dollar signatures, of world championships, the scene feels strange. Michael Jordan is in the middle of what might be the most important match of his life. No, of course not one of those basketball games he's always been used to winning. This is different, because the opponent sitting across from him is no ordinary defensive player. Juanita Vinoy, sitting at the table on the left. 17 years, 3 children, a lifetime. Hold on, I need to stop here for a moment. To keep bringing you stories like this, I need your support. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. That way you're telling YouTube that you love my stories, and in return, I'll be able to keep sharing more of them with you. I'm grateful you're here. Thank you. Now let's get back to where we left off. Juanita looks calm this morning, but it's the kind of calm you learn by practicing in front of a mirror. Or maybe it's the silence before the storm. There's an expression carefully placed on her face. Not angry, not fragile, not indifferent. Just ready. Her attorney Blake is shuffling through thick folders beside her, occasionally leaning in to whisper something in Juanita's ear. Each time, Juanita gives a small nod. Yes, keep going. I'm ready. In the front row of the gallery sits Diana, senior sports and legal correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. 42 years old, short hair, pale complexion. Notebook open, pen twirling between her fingers. She's been walking courthouse hallways for 14 years. She's covered divorce cases, money battles, image crises. But this morning, even she feels something different. She can't quite explain it yet. She just knows and feels it. This is not an ordinary case. Through the right door of the courtroom walks Jordan's lead attorney, Calvin. 46 years old, gray hair, measured steps. One of Chicago's leading civil law specialists. There's no excitement in his shoulders, no tension either. Just a detached, almost tired certainty. And in his hand, a white envelope. Plain, ordinary, unsealed. Blake sees it. He stops flipping through his files. Juanita sees it too, and her eyes catch on that envelope for just half a second. But that half second is noticed. Calvin steps up to the front of the table. He turns toward the judge. "Your Honor," he says, his voice carrying across the entire courtroom without ever rising. "The evidence we are presenting today will change the course of this case entirely." The envelope sits on the table. Inside it is a photograph, and that photograph is about to end everything. After this case, you'll learn, how did a single photograph close one of the most expensive divorce cases in sports history? But before we get there, we need to go back 4 years, because this story didn't start inside a courtroom. It started much earlier, in a much quieter place. More than a home, Las Vegas, September 1989, 3 in the morning. Chapel Avenue in Las Vegas never really sleeps, but at 3 a.m. it wraps itself in a strange kind of quiet. The neon lights are still on, but the crowds have thinned. 2 people are standing outside the entrance of the little white chapel. Michael Jordan and Juanita Vinoy. The prenuptial agreement still hasn't been signed. Their attorneys don't know. Well, Juanita's attorney does, because Juanita had given him the assignment 2 months earlier. While telling him about her marriage plans with Jordan, the attorney had gotten to work, drafted the paperwork. But that night, Juanita called and said, We're still in Las Vegas, and we got married before I could tell you. An unexpected decision. But these were unexpected people. Juanita Vinoy was the kind of woman who could stand beside a man like Michael Jordan. She had a grounded kind of awareness, the kind that doesn't get lost in glamorous crowds, the kind that changes a room just by walking into it. She knew very well the difference between being social and truly being present. Jordan, for all the brilliance of his career, was actually tired in his private life. The travel, the pressure, the cameras, the expectations. Juanita was different to him. She was a point of balance. But that night, the papers went unsigned. The next morning, the attorney called and continued working on what's known as a post-nuptial agreement, the version of a marriage contract signed after the wedding. It was legally valid, but it walked on far more delicate ground in practice. Because if one party didn't want to sign, allegations of coercion could easily come up. And that post-nuptial agreement was never fully signed either, at least not in 1989. As the years went on, Jordan's wealth multiplied. NBA salaries, the Nike deal, Gatorade, Hanes, McDonald's, Ballpark Franks. And with every new sponsorship, that core family life in Chicago inched a little closer to the edge of a cliff. The children came. Jeffrey, Marcus, Jasmine. Juanita raised them, went to school meetings, ran the backstage, kept the family together. Jordan, meanwhile, was on the courts, in commercials, on golf courses, in casinos. You know, this is a story many NBA wives have lived. But you have to admit, none of their husbands had a fortune this large. Now let's get to the anatomy of an empire. 1995 through 2002. Jordan had stepped away and come back. The baseball experiment was behind him. The Bulls were climbing back to the top. And with every championship, Jordan's value, not just financially, but symbolically, was multiplying. Think about it. At that time, one of the 10 most recognized brand names in the entire world belonged to a single human being, Jordan. Nike built a full product line just for him. Ad agencies paid millions for nothing more than a simple raise of his eyebrow. Golf magazine covers, commercial real estate deals, investments in the Charlotte area. This wasn't an athlete's wealth anymore. This was a media empire. By 2002, Jordan's fortune had reached $398 million. And that year, Juanita Vinoy filed for divorce. February 2002, in the dead of winter, without warning, suddenly. That case was demanding half of the $398 million, $199 million. The news spread around the world within hours. Jordan's wife is filing for divorce. $199 million demand. Headlines, analysis, speculation. But exactly 1 month later, Juanita dropped the case. A settlement was reached, they said. They'll be together again, they said. And that divorce file that had grabbed the world's attention was suddenly closed. But before it closed, something very important happened. Postnup, February 2002. During that 1 month period, attorneys worked quietly. Jordan's advisors and lawyers calculated what this separation would mean in the long run. One thing was clear. Jordan and Juanita had been together since 1989 without any legal protection in place. If they actually split, or if they ever did, how the assets would be divided in court would be a highly contested matter. "We need to get this sorted out," said Jordan's financial advisor, someone whose name appears in legal records, but who never once stepped into the public eye. And Juanita didn't object to that. In fact, as would later come to light, she agreed. February 14th, 2002, Valentine's Day night, the annual gala of one of Chicago's most prestigious philanthropic foundations. Jordan wasn't in the city that night. He was in Palm Springs for a golf tournament. Juanita went to the gala alone. The event mattered for social representation, and besides, she wanted to feel more at ease than on just another February evening. That night, in a small room off the side lobby of the gala venue, Juanita Vinoy sat down across from a table. Beside her were Jordan's financial advisor and a notary public. This wasn't some formal, cold-blooded meeting. The document was already on the table, ready. Supplemental Marital Agreement, February 2002. This document contained additional provisions outlining how the assets would be handled going forward. It had been drafted by attorneys. It was notarized, and the legal representatives of both parties had reviewed the process beforehand. Juanita signed it. At that moment, a photographer was doing a routine shoot, the kind done constantly at gala nights. Faces gathering in the lobby, agreements, conversations. That photographer wasn't creating a work of art. He was just doing his job. The photograph was filed away in an archive. and it waited there for 4 years. Years and the unraveling. 2002 to 2006. After Juanita dropped the case, the outside world said, Jordan and Juanita made up. But those close to them knew. This wasn't peace. This was a strategy, a strategic pause, a decision by both sides to manage the situation for a while longer. After retirement, Jordan somehow became an even busier man, paradoxically. Yes, as surprising as that sounds, that's the truth. Even off the court, the world wouldn't let him go. Franchise deals tied to Charlotte, executive positions, global ad tours. Jordan wasn't the kind of person who clocked in at 8 a.m. like an office worker, but he was everywhere, in the middle of everything. Juanita, meanwhile, stayed home. Early 2005, the couple began living separately. They didn't share that with the public. It was for the kids, for appearances. Maybe for a small piece of hope, too. But by December 2006, even that hope had run out. December 29th, 2006, a joint statement was released. Michael and Juanita Jordan have decided to end their 17-year marriage mutually and amicably. A judgment of dissolution of their marriage has been entered today. No further statements will be made regarding this matter. Short, official, cold. But was their split truly amicable? If you were in Juanita's shoes, how would you have chosen to end a marriage like that? Share your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely love to know. Because the negotiations happening behind the scenes were anything but amicable. Because Juanita's attorney Blake, in the weeks before that statement was released, had put a number on the table for Jordan's side. Half the fortune. At that point, Jordan's estimated net worth was around $500 million. That means the demand was $250 million. Eddie in the Search, November 2006. Before Calvin took this case, he spent weeks going through the files. In his office, that corner unit in the middle of the city, there were 2 different layouts spread across his desk. The first was a chronological map of Jordan's wealth. What existed in which year, what didn't, which deal had been signed when. The second was the details of Juanita's legal demands. Blake was too smart. In fact, let's be honest, he was Juanita's greatest asset, because his legal arguments were rock solid. Under Illinois law, for a couple that had married in 1989 without a signed agreement, the answer was clear. If there was no valid contract in place, the wealth accumulated during the marriage was shared property. And the agreement they had tried to put together in 1989 had never been properly signed. But there was 2002. There was that document. The problem was this. Blake knew about the 2002 document too. In fact, the argument he had prepared to knock it out was this. This document was signed by my client Juanita Vinoy, without full legal representation and under duress. It should be deemed invalid. I did say Blake was too smart, didn't I? Calvin could fight that argument on paper, but in front of a judge without a jury, abstract legal debates take time, and cases that take time produce unpredictable outcomes. We need concrete proof of the moment Juanita signed that document, Calvin said, staring at the glass wall of his office. Not just the signature, the environment, the absence of pressure. A conscious decision. He called Eddie. Eddie was one of those private investigators in Chicago, not widely known in the public, but with a name that circulated in legal circles. 41 years old, blonde, more of a listener than a talker. He had no presence on social media, which, for people in this line of work, was sometimes taken as a mark of quality. Calvin had known him for over a decade and trusted him. February 2002, Calvin said. Find out what we have from that night and what we don't. Eddie took out his notepad. He didn't ask any questions. For 3 weeks, Eddie worked his way into photographer archives. He tracked down Gala event organizers. Not Istanbul, Chicago. A half-dozen photographers who documented the city's social events had only just begun uploading their decade-old archives to digital platforms. Eddie went through both the physical and digital archives of that transition period, one by one. On the 19th day, he found a folder in a photographer's February 2002 archive. Hart Foundation Gala, St. Valentine's Night. There were hundreds of photographs inside. Eddie moved through them systematically. The cocktail area, the dance floor, the main lobby, the side rooms. And there it was. A photograph time-stamped February 14th, 2002, 10:17 p.m. Juanita Vinoy, seated across a table, a pen in her hand. 2 people beside her, one well-dressed, professional posture, the other wearing a lanyard, clearly someone who worked at a notary's office. And just beneath Juanita's hand, on the document sitting on the table, the heading was legible. Eddie enlarged the photograph. He read the heading. He picked up his phone. "Calvin," he said, "we found it." A pause. "The photograph?" "The photograph." Another silence. Then Calvin said something brief and hung up. That night, the lights in the office burned late. The first day of court, December 2006. Diana was up at 5 in the morning. This was the hour when big cases first began inside her. As the coffee maker ran, she opened her notepad and went over the questions she'd prepared the day before. She knew what Blake would do on the first day. Lay out Juanita's role during the marriage in quantifiable terms. Household management, childcare, social representation, educational coordination. He would try to back all of it up with dollar amounts, a kind of invisible labor argument. It was a strong argument, but Diana kept thinking about Calvin's calm. Before big moves, attorneys usually give off certain signals. They dress a little more carefully. They walk a little faster. Yesterday, when Calvin had passed her in the hallway, he looked like he was having the most ordinary workday of his life, even while carrying that envelope. That was either a sign of enormous confidence or something even bigger. Court began at 9:05. Blake stood up. Tall, 48 years old, his deep voice filling the room the moment he opened his mouth. A well-established name in the Chicago legal world. The kind who never does half a job for his clients. "Your Honor," Blake said, "this is not a simple divorce case. This is about demanding accountability for 17 years of partnership." And for the next 2 hours, Blake laid out the role Juanita had carried throughout the marriage. Not just emotional, economic. The contribution of a woman who organized sponsor dinners, raised 3 children, and carried the weight of representing the family. That contribution had a calculable value. It had to. Some people in the courtroom nodded. Diana took notes. Jordan looked on from his left side, calm. Juanita followed every sentence Blake spoke. Sometimes she folded her hands in her palms. Sometimes she just stared. But the glass of water sitting on the table in front of her never changed that morning. She didn't take a sip. It just sat there. Calvin didn't wait to take the floor. The first day was preparation, not defense. But he had left that envelope on the corner of his table. In plain sight, Diana noticed it. And in the margin of her notepad, in small letters, she wrote, "The envelope. Why isn't Calvin opening it today?" The dawn of the photograph. Day 2. It was still only 8:30 the second morning. Amber was waiting in the hallway. Diana had never seen her before, but there was something familiar about the way she carried herself in the gallery. That ease with courtrooms. The posture of someone who isn't a stranger to them, but isn't a party to them either. Around 40, brown jacket, simple accessories. No paper, no phone in her hands. Just waiting. "I used to be Juanita's assistant," Amber said as Diana approached. "We worked together for 3 years. From 2001 to 2004. Diana stopped. The pen was already in her hand. "Okay, so why are you following this case?" Amber thought about it. Before answering, she looked down the far end of the hallway. "Because I was there on February 14th, 2002, the night of the gala," she said. Diana didn't say a word. She waited. "When Juanita signed that document," Amber continued slowly, "I was in the side room, just outside the door. Then she came out and looked at me. Things have finally become clear," she said. She was at ease. She genuinely looked at ease. Diana looked up. "Did you pass this along to the other side?" Amber gave a quiet smile and shook her head. "Blake never called me." The courtroom door opened. The clerk called everyone in. Diana walked in briskly. In the corner of the page, she wrote, "Amber, front row witness, unused." 1 hour after the session began, Calvin stood up. "Will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. We will now be presenting a decisive piece. We will now be presenting a decisive piece of evidence. Blake rose from his seat. Your Honor, I object. The evidence the defense intends to introduce was not previously disclosed. The evidence was submitted in full compliance with procedural rules, Calvin said, turning to the judge. The other party was notified last week. The judge adjusted his glasses. Continue. Calvin opened the envelope. He placed an enlarged A3-sized photograph on the table. Then he walked toward the judge and handed over a copy. This photograph, Calvin said, was taken on the evening of February 14th, 2002, at the Chicago Heart Foundation Gala. The photographer is a professional event photographer, and this image is on file in his archive with its date stamp. He paused. The person visible in the photograph is the plaintiff, Juanita Vanoy. The document she is holding is the supplemental marital agreement. One of the individuals seen beside her is the Jordan family's longtime financial advisor. The other is Notary Eddie Harrington, whose name is on record with the Cook County Notary Association. The courtroom froze. A long silence. Then Blake started listing his objections, but his voice didn't carry the same strength as before. And I want to emphasize this, Calvin went on, looking at the judge rather than anyone in the gallery. This signing took place while the Jordan family was not in attendance, while Ms. Juanita was present at her own social event. Her legal representative was not beside her. Her personal assistant was. There was no one else. In other words, as it is clearly understood, there was no element of coercion whatsoever. Juanita's face was visible in the photograph. She was smiling, softly, but she was smiling. Diana set down the pen she was holding on the edge of the table at that moment. She wrote in capital letters, "The photograph ended everything." Juanita's face. And the courtroom stayed nearly silent for 30 seconds. Then Blake rose and began listing technical objections. The context of the photograph, the full content of the document, whether Juanita had access to legal counsel at the time of signing, the reliability of the date stamp. Some of those were legitimate legal questions. But the people sitting in the gallery, the attorneys, the media representatives, everyone was feeling the same thing. These objections weren't stopping the wave, they were only slowing it down. Because this photograph was saying something that went beyond legal arguments. Hold on, I need to stop here for a moment. To keep bringing you stories like this, I need your support. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. That way, you're telling YouTube that you love my stories, and in return, I'll be able to keep sharing more of them with you. I'm grateful you're here. Thank you. Now let's get back to where we left off. Because this photograph was saying something that went beyond legal arguments. Juanita had been there that night. On her own 2 feet, by her own decision, with her own hand, she had signed it. There was no foundation for a "I was under duress" argument to stand on, at least not for that specific moment. Juanita stared at that photograph. Seconds passed. Blake was still talking, but Juanita couldn't pull her eyes away from that photograph. She was looking at her own smile, at who she had been 4 years ago, probably remembering what she had felt that night, the moment she had said, "Things have finally become clear." And then she pulled her eyes away from the photograph. She looked at her attorney. She said something in a low voice, something the courtroom never heard, but Blake's shoulders visibly dropped. Diana saw it, and she underlined the last sentence in her notepad. Calvin's room, lunch break. A recess was called. 30 minutes. The hallway came alive. Diana wrote fast. A few attorneys whispered among themselves. Some were staring at their phones. Diana caught Calvin just as he was coming out the door. How long? How long have you known?" she asked. Calvin stopped. He didn't fidget with his watch or his jacket. He just looked at her. "Long enough," he said. He didn't say another word. He went back inside. Diana stood in the hallway. She looked at her notes. Long enough. That was the most precise thing an attorney could ever say. It gave away too much and too little at the same time, but it carried a truth inside it. This defense was no accident. Calvin knew what he had in his hands when he took this case, and he hadn't taken it without knowing. In the afternoon session, Blake tried to keep pushing his technical arguments. He requested that the photograph be verified. The judge ordered an examination of the notary records. Eddie Harrington's records were reviewed through midnight, and by morning, the result was in. The signature was authentic, and the date and notary record matched. On the third day, both parties withdrew into a private negotiation room. Diana waited in the hallway. 3 hours passed, then 4. She ate lunch without stepping outside. And late in the afternoon, at 5:30 p.m., a joint statement was released. The parties have reached an out-of-court settlement. The case is closed. The number was not disclosed. But according to information circulating in legal circles, which Diana confirmed through 2 separate sources, Juanita did not receive half the fortune she had demanded. The 2002 supplemental agreement contained provisions protecting a specific portion of the assets, and that agreement held. Juanita Vinoy received $168 million, the 25,000 square foot Chicago home, and the majority of the children's custody. No further statement was made. No further statements will be made regarding this matter. Short, official, final. Blake, stepping out of court, told reporters only this: "Our client has chosen a resolution that serves the best interests of her family." That was the sentence of a side that hadn't won. Calvin, on the other hand, said nothing at all. He got in the car and left. Michael Jordan, for his part, made not a single public statement throughout the entire case. That was the approach he had always kept. Speak on the court, stay silent everywhere else. When he wasn't on the court, he left the court entirely. Otherwise, you'd be stepping onto your opponent's turf. But 3 days after the case closed, at a basketball event in Charlotte, when a journalist's microphone was extended toward him, he said only this: "Family matters more than anything. I'd rather talk about where we're going than how it ended." The microphone was pulled away. Jordan walked on. Diana added that quote to her story. Maybe she didn't need to, but that sentence said more than every court document combined. 2 days after the case closed, Diana called Amber. Amber spoke with her briefly over the phone. She asked that her name not be used openly. "How is Juanita?" Diana asked. Amber thought about it. "Tired, I think, but not from losing, from looking back. Maybe from not being able to get what was rightfully hers." "What do you think she felt when she saw that photograph?" Silence. "I was there that night," Amber finally said. "When she signed it, she turned and looked at me. She seemed calm. Things have finally become clear," she had said. "But now I look back and think, becoming clear doesn't mean finding peace. Sometimes it just means accepting that something has come to an end." She hung up. Diana didn't put that quote in her story, because some things, especially a woman who couldn't get what was rightfully hers, and her quiet wish to live that pain privately inside herself, deserve to be respected, don't you think? If you were in Juanita's shoes, how would you have felt? What would you have wanted to do? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Think about what a photograph is. A moment. A single moment. 1/500th of a second, maybe less. In that span, light strikes a sensor or a piece of film and freezes there. Smiles, wrinkles, glances, all of them trapped in that tiny frozen instant. The photographer who took that picture at the gala that night never planned to capture the moment Juanita Vinoy was signing. He wandered into that lobby hallway by chance. Maybe he was coming back from another shot. Maybe he was just looking for a quiet corner. And in that moment, he pressed the shutter, because something about the way Juanita was sitting told a story. Maybe the photographer sensed it unconsciously. Maybe it was just reflex. That photograph then went into an archive. It made it into the age of digitization. It waited 4 years inside a folder, among hundreds of other photographs. Then Eddie found it. And inside Courtroom 23, it came out of an envelope. That's the strange geometry of life. Important moments are lived without knowing they're important. Decisions gain their weight later. The Juanita who signed at that table in 2002 had felt at ease. Things have finally become clear, and the record of that moment of clarity was used against her 4 years later. Oh, Juanita, I can feel just how devastating and cruel that must have been. Very recently, my wife's sister found herself in a situation just like this. We supported her with every resource we had. Maybe one day I'll tell you her story too. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Now let's get back to our story and take a step back and think. Who won this case? From a legal standpoint, Jordan's side walked away from the table in the stronger position. The 2002 agreement held, and that meant a settlement far below the amount that had been demanded. But looking at it from another angle, Juanita Vinoy stepped into a marriage in 1989 without a signed contract. For 17 years, she was one of the invisible pillars of an empire. Children grew up, wealth multiplied. Jordan became a global icon, and Juanita quietly worked in the background through all of it. The full monetary value of that labor cannot be calculated. Illinois law tried to calculate it. Blake tried to lay it out through legal arguments, but a single photograph invalidated that accounting in court. Because the law measures the moment, not the intention. Documents are the photograph of that moment. And in that photograph, Juanita was smiling. Jeffrey, Marcus, and Jasmine Jordan, the quietest, most innocent, and yet most deeply affected parties in this case. The separation of their parents had begun for them long before any official date. Because you know how it is. Children feel it. The silence in the house, the shifting tones, whether meals are still shared together. Jeffrey and Marcus turned to basketball, partly following in their father's footsteps, partly carving out their own paths. Jasmine, years later, said this in a brief interview. I respect both of my parents. I know both of them have been through hard times. That's a remarkable level of maturity and self-awareness, but also a sentence that says a great deal. An empire can be divided by legal decisions, but a family, a real family, doesn't fit inside court documents. So, what happened next? Michael Jordan met Yvette Prieto in 2010. They married in 2013. This time, a tight prenuptial agreement was signed, a specific amount for each year spent together. Mutual, clear, in writing. They had twin girls. In 2023, he sold his stake in the Charlotte Hornets. By 2025, his net worth was estimated at $3.5 billion. Juanita Vinoy largely stepped away from public life. With $168 million and the Chicago mansion, she built a new life. In a 2013 interview, she said, "I wanted to simplify my life. For a long time, I was a character in someone else's story. Now, I want to write my own." Calvin became a partner at a major Chicago law firm. He never publicly talked about that case, but in legal circles, it gets talked about. Blake went on to take on other major cases in the years that followed. He's still fighting for his clients. Diana won 2 awards for the series of articles she wrote about that case. Years later, in a chapter of a book she wrote on sports law, without naming anyone but without changing a single detail, she wrote about Courtroom 23. And Amber, Juanita's former assistant, opened a small boutique in the north side of Chicago. When Diana stopped by years later, we asked, "What do you still think about that night?" Amber smiled. When Juanita signed, she felt relieved. But feeling relieved doesn't mean everything is going to be okay. It just means you've set down the weight of that moment. And sometimes that weight comes back as a different kind of weight later on. And it did. She paused. "Maybe these kinds of mistakes are the best teachers we have in life, don't you think?" she said. And then a meaningful, wise silence settled in. Winter mornings in Chicago never change. The marble steps outside the Cook County Superior Court stand cold, gray, and silent. They've carried thousands of stories. Money disputes, inheritance battles, divorces, settlements. Every one of them walked in and one day walked out. Michael Jordan never went back there. Neither did Juanita. But one photograph, never planned when it was taken, never considered important when it was shot, forgotten while it sat in an archive, walked into that courtroom one morning at 9:47, took center stage, and changed everything. This is not just the story of a divorce case. This is a story about the weight of a moment, about a signature, a smile, and the memory of a woman who said one night, "Things have finally become clear." And it reminds us of this. The most critical decisions in life are usually made in the most ordinary moments. At gala nights, in lobby hallways, in the middle of a warm conversation with a friend, over a pleasant dinner. Maybe in a moment, just like Juanita, when we think we've finally found peace, not realizing that very moment will later be used against us as leverage. We usually don't even notice, not until it's held over us, just like it was in Juanita's story. Dear friends, I wish you a beautiful and meaningful life, one where your decisions are never used against you. If you've enjoyed these stories, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Share your own stories in the comments. Until next time, for more stories full of meaning, take care.